Every evening at exactly 6 p.m., when the last music student packed up their violin case and headed home, Maria would wheel her cleaning cart down the long marble hallway of the Riverside Music Academy. The sound of her footsteps echoed through. The empty corridors, mixing with the faint melodies that still seemed to linger in the air from hours of practice sessions. Maria had been working as a cleaner at the academy for almost 4 years now. She knew every corner of the building, from the dusty storage rooms filled with old sheet music to the grand recital hall where famous musicians sometimes performed. But what she loved most were the practice rooms, those small, soundproof spaces where dreams were born and sometimes broken. The job wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills. Maria needed every dollar she could get. She lived in a tiny apartment across town with her elderly mother and her teenage brother Luis. Her mother's medical bills were expensive, and Luis was a senior in high school with dreams of going to college. Someone had to keep the family together, and that someone was Maria. But there was something special about working at the music academy. As she cleaned each practice room, Maria would often pause to listen. She heard the frustration in a violin, students' shaky bow strokes. She witnessed the joy when someone finally nailed a difficult piano passage they'd been struggling with for weeks. She felt the nervous energy before auditions and the relief when they were over. Maria had always loved music, even as a little girl. She remembered sitting in her grandmother's living room, watching her play an old upright piano that had seen better days. Her grandmother's fingers would dance across the yellow keys, bringing beautiful melodies to life. Music, her grandmother would say with a smile, is the language of the heart, Mija. It doesn't matter if you're rich or poor, young or old. If you have music in your soul, you have everything. Those were simpler times, before life got complicated. Before her father left when she was 12. Before her grandmother passed away when she was 16. Before the responsibilities of adult life crashed down on her shoulders like a heavy wave. Now, at 28, Maria found herself living vicariously through the students at the academy. She would finish cleaning a practice room and sometimes sit at the piano bench for just a moment, running her fingers gently over the keys without making a sound. She wondered what it would feel like to really play, to create music instead of just listening to it. At home, Maria had managed to buy an old electronic keyboard from a thrift store. It wasn't much, some of the keys stuck and the speakers crackled, but it was hers. After her mother went to sleep and Luis finished his homework, Maria would put on headphones and quietly teach herself to play. She watched free videos online, learning basic chords and simple songs. Her fingers were clumsy at first, but slowly, week by week, month by month, she got better. She never told anyone about her secret hobby. It felt almost embarrassing, like a grown woman playing pretend. What would people think if they knew the cleaning lady was trying to learn piano? She imagined them laughing, saying she was too old, too poor, too uneducated to understand real music. The students at the academy came from different worlds. Many drove expensive cars and wore designer clothes. They talked about private lessons that cost more than Maria made in a week. Their parents were doctors, lawyers, business owners, people who could afford to nurture their children's musical talents. There was one student who particularly caught Maria's attention, though not for good reasons. His name was Alexander Whitmore, and he was everything Maria wasn't. Tall, confident, and undeniably talented, he carried himself like he owned the world. His family name was actually engraved on a plaque in the Academy's main lobby, recognizing their generous donations over the years. Alexander was a senior at the Academy, specializing in piano. Maria had heard him play many times while cleaning nearby rooms, and she had to admit he was incredibly skilled. His fingers flew across the keys with precision and power, bringing complex classical pieces to life. But there was something cold about his playing, something that reminded Maria more of a machine than a human being expressing emotion. What bothered Maria most about Alexander wasn't his talent. It was his attitude. She had overheard him talking to other students, making cruel comments about people he considered beneath him. He mocked students who couldn't afford private lessons, calling them charity cases. He rolled his eyes when younger students made mistakes, as if their struggles personally offended him. Maria tried to stay invisible around Alexander. She would clean his practice room quickly and quietly, hoping not to attract his attention. But she couldn't help noticing things about him. The way he slammed the piano lid when frustrated, the way he spoke rudely to academy staff, the way he seemed to believe that his family's money made him superior to everyone else. One evening in early October, Maria was cleaning the hallway outside practice room 7 when she heard the most beautiful music she had ever experienced. It was a Chopin nocturne, but played with such tenderness and emotion that it made her stop breathing. She leaned against her mop handle, completely mesmerized by the melody floating through the slightly open door. The music seemed to tell a story of love and loss, hope and despair, all woven together in a tapestry of notes that spoke directly to her heart. Maria felt tears forming in her eyes as she listened. This was the kind of playing her grandmother had always talked about. Music that touched the soul. She stood there for nearly 10 minutes, completely forgetting about her work. The music washed over her like warm sunlight, and for those precious moments, all her worries and responsibilities seemed to fade away. She was just a woman listening to something beautiful, something that made her remember why she had fallen in love with music in the first place. When the final notes faded into silence, Maria quickly wiped her eyes and prepared to move on before whoever was inside came out. She didn't want to be caught standing there like some kind of musical voyeur. But as she turned to wheel her cart away, the practice room door swung open. Alexander stepped out, his expensive leather bag slung over his shoulder. He stopped when he saw Maria standing there with her cleaning supplies, and a slow, unpleasant smile spread across his face. "Well, well," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Enjoying the free concert?" Maria felt her face flush red with embarrassment. "I'm sorry," she stammered. "I was just cleaning and I couldn't help but hear—" "Of course you couldn't," Alexander interrupted, clearly enjoying her discomfort. "I suppose that's about as close to real music as someone like you gets, right?" The words stung, but Maria tried to keep her dignity intact. "It was very beautiful," she said quietly. "You play wonderfully." Alexander's smile grew wider, but there was no warmth in it. "I should hope so. I've been studying piano since I was 4 years old. I've had the best teachers money can buy. I've performed in concert halls across the country." He paused, looking her up and down dismissively. "Not everyone can appreciate true artistry, of course, but I suppose even—" He gestured, vaguely at her uniform and cleaning cart. "Even the help can recognize quality when they hear it." Maria felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment as Alexander looked down at her with that smug expression. She wanted to disappear into the floor, but something inside her wouldn't let his comment pass completely. "I actually do play a little," she said softly, immediately regretting the words as soon as they left her mouth. Alexander's eyebrows shot up in surprise, and then he let out a laugh that echoed through the empty hallway. It wasn't a kind laugh. It was the sort of laugh that made Maria feel about 2 inches tall. "You? Play piano?" He shook his head, still chuckling. "That's rich. What do you play on, the vacuum cleaner?" He looked at her cleaning supplies and laughed again. "Let me guess, you probably hunt and peck with 2 fingers on some toy keyboard you got from a garage sale." Maria's face went hot with shame, but she tried to stand a little straighter. "I have a keyboard at home. I taught myself some songs." "Taught yourself," Alexander repeated, making the words sound ridiculous. "Do you have any idea what real piano playing involves? It's not just pressing keys and hoping for the best. There are years of proper technique, music theory, classical training. You can't just watch a few YouTube videos and call yourself a pianist. He stepped closer, and Maria could smell his expensive cologne. Everything about him screamed money and privilege, from his perfectly styled hair to his Italian leather shoes. That probably cost more than she made in 2 months. Look, he continued, his voice taking on a fake patient tone, like he was explaining something to a small child. I'm sure you mean well, and there's nothing wrong with having hobbies, but there's a difference between playing around on a keyboard and actually being a musician. What I do in there, he pointed back toward the practice room, that's art. That's years of dedication and sacrifice. That's talent combined with the finest training money can buy. Maria wanted to argue, to tell him that music wasn't just about money and fancy schools. She wanted to say that her grandmother had taught her that music came from the heart, not from a bank account. But the words stuck in her throat. Who was she to argue with someone who had clearly achieved so much? I understand, she whispered, gripping the handle of her mop cart tighter. Do you? Alexander tilted his head, studying her face. Because I get the feeling you think you're some kind of hidden talent or something. Like those movies where the janitor turns out to be a secret. Genius. He laughed again. This is real life, not Hollywood. Some people are born for greatness. And others, he shrugged, others clean up after them. With that, he walked away, his footsteps echoing confidently down the marble hallway. Maria stood there for a long moment, feeling smaller than she had in years. She finished her cleaning in silence, Alexander's words replaying in her mind over and over again. The next few days were rough. Maria tried to focus on her work, but she couldn't shake the feeling that everyone was looking at her differently. Of course, that was impossible. Nobody else had been there to witness her humiliation. But every time she passed a practice room where Alexander was playing, she remembered his cruel laughter and felt her face flush with shame. At home, she found herself avoiding her little keyboard. Every time she looked at it, she heard Alexander's voice asking if she played on a vacuum cleaner. Maybe he was right. Maybe she had been fooling herself all along. But the worst was yet to come. A few days later, Maria was cleaning the main lobby when she overheard Alexander talking to a group of his friends. They were gathered near the grand staircase, their voices carrying easily across the open space. She tried not to listen, but it was hard to ignore them when Alexander's voice got louder and more animated. So get this, he was saying, clearly enjoying being the center of attention. The other night I'm leaving practice, right? And I find our cleaning lady standing outside my door just listening to me play. Maria's blood went cold. She kept her head down, pretending to polish the same spot on the reception desk over and over again. That's kind of sweet, actually, said one of the girls in the group. Oh, it gets better, Alexander continued. She tells me she plays piano, too. Can you imagine? I'm sure she bangs out chopsticks with 2 fingers and thinks she's the next Mozart. The group erupted in laughter. Maria's hands shook as she continued cleaning, praying they wouldn't notice her. You're terrible, Alex, one of his friends said, but she was still giggling. Maybe she's actually good. Right, Alexander scoffed, and maybe I'll win the lottery tomorrow. Look, I'm not trying to be mean, but there's a difference between real music and whatever noise someone makes when they mess around on a cheap keyboard. This is a serious institution. We're here to study with the best teachers in the country, preparing for careers as professional musicians. We're not playing around. Still, another student chimed in, it's kind of inspiring that she's trying to learn. Inspiring? Alexander's voice took on that fake patient tone again. What's inspiring about delusion? It's like watching someone who can barely walk thinking they can run a marathon. It's not inspiring, it's sad. And frankly, it's a little embarrassing. I mean, what's next? Is the guy who mows the lawn going to tell us he's a composer? The laughter got louder, and Maria felt tears starting to form in her eyes. She quickly gathered her cleaning supplies and hurried toward the supply closet, hoping to escape before anyone noticed her. But her luck ran out. Just as she was almost to safety, she heard Alexander's voice call out across the lobby. "Oh, hey there!" he said, in a voice that was way too cheerful to be genuine. We were just talking about music. You know how it is." Maria stopped walking but didn't turn around. She could feel every pair of eyes in the group staring at her. "Actually," Alexander continued, and Maria could hear the grin in his voice, "we were just discussing how much we all love sharing music with people. In fact, we're putting together a little informal recital next week. Nothing too fancy, just students and faculty sharing what we've been working on." Maria's heart sank. She knew where this was going. "You should totally come," one of the girls added, though her voice sounded uncertain, like she wasn't sure if this was a good idea. "Better yet," Alexander said, his voice getting louder and more theatrical, "maybe you'd like to perform for us. I mean, you did say you play piano, right? This would be a perfect opportunity to share your talent with everyone." The lobby went quiet. Maria could practically feel the awkwardness radiating from the other students. Some of them were probably nice kids who didn't want to see her humiliated, but none of them were brave enough to speak up against Alexander. "I couldn't," Maria said quietly, still not turning around. "Oh, come on," Alexander pressed. "Don't be modest. I'm sure everyone would love to hear what you've been working on. What do you say? It's next Friday at 7, right here in the main recital hall, the same stage where famous pianists have performed. Doesn't that sound exciting?" Maria finally turned around, her face burning with embarrassment. The group of students was watching her like she was some kind of zoo animal. Some looked curious, others uncomfortable, and a few seemed to be enjoying the show. "I really couldn't," she repeated. "Why not?" Alexander asked with fake innocence. "I thought you said you played piano. This is your chance to prove it." The challenge hung in the air like a sword waiting to fall. Maria knew this was a trap. Alexander was setting her up for public humiliation, and everyone in the lobby knew it. The smart thing to do would be to decline politely and walk away, to keep her head down and continue with her life as it was. But something in his tone, something in the way he was looking at her like she was nothing, like she didn't deserve to even dream about making music, sparked something inside her that she hadn't felt in years. "Okay," she heard herself say. The words seemed to surprise everyone, including herself. Alexander's smug expression flickered for just a moment. "I'm sorry. What?" I said, "Okay." Maria's voice was stronger this time. "I'll play something at your recital." The silence that followed was deafening. Alexander recovered quickly, his smile returning, but it looked forced now. "Wonderful," he said, though he didn't sound like he thought it was wonderful at all. "This is going to be interesting." The moment Maria said yes, she immediately wanted to take it back. What had she been thinking? As she watched Alexander's face shift from surprise to barely contained glee, she realized she had just walked straight into his trap. But it was too late now. The words were out there, hanging in the air like a challenge that couldn't be undone. "Perfect," Alexander said, his smile returning full force. "Friday night, 7 o'clock sharp, don't be late." He turned to his friends with obvious excitement. "This is going to be quite a show, everyone. Make sure you tell people about it." As the group dispersed, chattering excitedly among themselves, Maria stood alone in the lobby feeling like she might throw up. What had she just done? She was going to humiliate herself in front of dozens of people. Worse, she was going to prove Alexander right about everything he'd said. The news spread through the academy faster than wildfire. By the next morning, it seemed like everyone knew about the upcoming recital and Maria's participation. Students whispered in the hallways, and Maria caught them staring at her as she went about her cleaning duties. Some looked at her with pity, others with curiosity, and a few with the kind of excitement people get when they're about to witness a train wreck. Professor Elena Rodriguez, one of the piano instructors, approached Maria on Wednesday afternoon. She was a kind woman in her 50s with gentle eyes and graying hair pulled back in a simple bun. Unlike many of the faculty members who barely acknowledged the cleaning staff, Professor Rodriguez had always been friendly to Maria. Maria, she said softly, catching up with her in the hallway. "Can we talk for a moment?" Maria's heart sank. She was probably going to get fired before she even had a chance to embarrass herself on stage. "Yes, ma'am?" "I heard about Friday night, Professor," Rodriguez said, her voice full of concern. "Are you sure this is something you want to do?" Maria looked down at her feet. "I already said I would. That doesn't mean you can't change your mind. Nobody would think less of you for backing out. In fact," she paused, choosing her words carefully, "some people might respect you more for it." "You think I'm going to make a fool of myself," Maria said quietly. Professor Rodriguez sighed. "I think Alexander Whitmore is setting you up to fail, and I don't like seeing anyone get hurt for someone else's entertainment. So you think I can't really play either?" "I don't know if you can play or not," Professor Rodriguez said honestly. "But I know this isn't the right way to find out. Performing in front of an audience for the first time should be a joy, not a punishment. It should be about sharing something beautiful, not about proving a point." Maria felt tears starting to form in her eyes. "Everyone thinks I'm crazy for even trying. Are you crazy for trying?" Professor Rodriguez asked gently. "Or are you braver than the rest of us?" That evening, Maria went home and stared at her little keyboard for a long time. It sat in the corner of her bedroom, looking smaller and more pathetic than ever. The keys were yellowed with age, and several had lost their bounce. How could she possibly perform on this thing when Alexander played on concert grand pianos that cost more than her car? But as she sat there, she remembered her grandmother's words about music being the language of the heart. Maybe Professor Rodriguez was right. Maybe this was about more than proving Alexander wrong. Maybe this was about proving something to herself. She turned on the keyboard and started to play. Her fingers moved slowly at first, finding the melody of a simple song she'd learned months ago. But as the music filled her small room, something shifted inside her. She wasn't thinking about Alexander anymore, or about the academy, or about Friday night. She was just playing, letting the music flow through her the way it had when she was a little girl listening to her grandmother. Over the next 2 days, Maria barely slept. She would come home from work exhausted, but instead of collapsing into bed, she would sit at her keyboard for hours. She played every song she knew, over and over again, trying to decide what to perform. Nothing seemed good enough. Everything sounded amateur compared to the complex classical pieces she heard at the academy every day. By Thursday night, panic was setting in. Maria's hands were shaking as she tried to practice. She kept making mistakes, hitting wrong notes, losing the rhythm. Her brother Luis knocked on her door around midnight. "Maria, you okay in there? You've been playing for like 6 hours." She opened the door, and Luis could see the stress written all over her face. "I can't do this, Luis. I'm going to embarrass myself in front of everyone tomorrow." Luis, who was 17 and usually too cool to worry about his older sister's problems, sat down on her bed. "Why did you say yes in the first place?" Maria thought about it. "Because I was angry. Because he made me feel like I was nothing, like people like us don't deserve to dream about making music. So show him he's wrong. But what if he's right? What if I really am just fooling myself?" Luis looked at his sister, remembering all the nights he'd fallen asleep to the sound of her playing in the next room. "Maria, you know that song you play sometimes? The slow, sad one that makes me think about Abuela?" She nodded. It was a piece she'd learned by ear, something she'd heard at the academy and taught herself to play. "That song makes me cry every time," Luis said. "Not because it's sad, but because it's so beautiful. If you can make me feel that much just sitting in my room doing homework, imagine what you could do on a real piano." Friday evening arrived faster than Maria wanted it to. She got to the academy early, before the audience started arriving, and stood outside the main recital hall. Through the glass doors, she could see the beautiful grand piano sitting alone on the stage under the bright lights. It looked enormous and intimidating, nothing like her little keyboard at home. Students began filing in around 6:30. Maria watched from the hallway as they filled the seats, talking and laughing among themselves. Some of the faculty had come too, including Professor Rodriguez, who gave Maria an encouraging smile when she saw her. Alexander arrived at exactly 7 o'clock, looking confident and relaxed in his expensive suit. He was carrying sheet music and had that same smug expression he'd worn all week. Several of his friends gathered around him, and Maria could hear him talking about the entertainment they were all about to witness. The informal recital began with a flute student playing a Mozart piece. She was followed by a violinist, then a cellist, and then Alexander himself. He performed a complex Chopin etude with technical perfection, his fingers flying across the keys with mechanical precision. The audience applauded politely, and Alexander took a bow with obvious satisfaction. Then it was Maria's turn. The moderator, a senior student, looked uncomfortable as he announced her name. And now we have Maria Gonzalez, who works here at the Academy and would like to share something with us tonight. The applause was scattered and awkward. Maria could feel hundreds of eyes on her as she walked toward the stage. Her heart was pounding so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. Her palms were sweaty, and her legs felt like they might give out at any moment. As she climbed the steps to the stage, she heard someone in the audience whisper, "This is so awkward." Another voice said, "I feel bad for her." Someone else shushed them, but the damage was done. Maria's face burned with embarrassment. She sat down at the piano bench and looked out at the audience. The lights were bright, making it hard to see individual faces, but she could feel their attention like a weight pressing down on her. In the front row, Alexander was leaning forward with obvious anticipation, ready to enjoy her failure. Maria placed her hands on the keys and took a deep breath. This was it. There was no turning back now. Whatever happened next would determine not just how these people saw her, but how she saw herself for the rest of her life. The hall was completely silent, waiting. Maria's hands hovered over the keys for what felt like forever. The silence in the hall was so complete, she could hear her own heartbeat. In the front row, Alexander was practically vibrating with excitement, ready to witness her humiliation. Some people in the audience looked uncomfortable, like they didn't want to be part of whatever was about to happen. Then Maria pressed a single key. It wasn't just any note. It was a deep, resonant middle C, played with such perfect touch and control that it seemed to fill every corner of the vast recital hall. The note hung in the air, pure and powerful, carrying a weight that made everyone sit up a little straighter. But that was just the beginning. What came next made Alexander's confident smile freeze on his face. Maria's left hand found its position, and she began the opening of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, one of the most difficult and beloved pieces in all of classical music. But she wasn't playing the simplified version you might expect from someone who learned on YouTube. This was the real thing, in all its complex, heart-wrenching glory. The melody poured from the piano like liquid gold. Maria's right hand sang the famous opening theme with such tenderness and emotion that people in the audience stopped breathing. Her left hand provided a rich, supporting harmony that showed she understood not just the notes, but the soul of the music. Alexander's mouth fell open. This wasn't possible. The woman who cleaned his practice room, who lived in some tiny apartment across town, who taught herself to play on a cheap keyboard, she couldn't be doing this. But she was. As Maria moved into the more complex passages, her technique became undeniable. Her fingers moved with precision and grace across the keys, handling runs and arpeggios that would challenge even advanced students. But it wasn't just technical skill. There was something deeper happening here, something that turned notes on a page into pure emotion. Professor Rodriguez felt tears starting to form in her eyes. In 30 years of teaching, She had heard this piece performed hundreds of times by students, by colleagues, even by famous concert pianists, but she had never heard it played with such raw, honest emotion. Maria wasn't just playing the notes. She was living them, breathing them, pouring her heart out for everyone to hear. The audience was completely mesmerized. Students who had been whispering and fidgeting just minutes before now sat in stunned silence. This was music the way it was meant to be, not as a display of technical prowess, but as a conversation between souls. As Maria moved through the piece, memories flowed through her mind. She thought about her grandmother's weathered hands on those old yellow keys. She thought about all the nights she'd sat in her small room, dreaming of making music like this. She thought about every cruel word Alexander had said, every doubt she'd had about herself, every moment she'd felt too small, too poor, too ordinary to deserve something beautiful. But mostly, she just played. The music carried her away from the stage, away from the audience, away from her fears and insecurities. For these precious minutes, she was exactly where she belonged. When she reached the climactic section of the piece, Maria's playing took on an intensity that made the piano seem to sing and cry at the same time. Her whole body moved with the music, not in a showy way, but like someone completely lost in the joy of creation. Every note was perfect, not because she was trying to impress anyone, but because the music demanded nothing less. Alexander sat, frozen in his seat, his face pale with shock. Everything he thought he knew about talent, about privilege, about who deserved to make music, was crumbling around him. This woman, who he had dismissed and mocked, was playing better than he ever had in his life. And she was doing it with such natural musicality that it made his own technically perfect but emotionally cold performances seem hollow by comparison. As Maria played the final soaring phrases of the piece, the entire hall seemed to hold its breath. The music built to its emotional peak and then settled into the gentle, peaceful conclusion. The last notes faded into silence, and for a moment, nobody moved. The quiet stretched on and on. Maria lifted her hands from the keys and looked out at the audience, suddenly remembering where she was. Had she done something wrong? Was everyone shocked by how bad she was? Then Professor Rodriguez started to clap. It began slowly, just her lone applause echoing in the silent hall. But within seconds, the entire audience erupted. People jumped to their feet, clapping and cheering with an enthusiasm that shook the walls. Students were crying. Faculty members were shaking their heads in amazement. Even some of Alexander's friends were applauding wildly, their faces showing pure awe. The standing ovation went on for nearly 5 minutes. Maria sat at the piano bench, overwhelmed by the response. She had expected polite applause at best, maybe even embarrassed silence. She never imagined this. When the applause finally died down, the hall remained silent for another long moment. Then Professor Rodriguez stood up and spoke, her voice carrying clearly through the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, "we have just witnessed something extraordinary. Maria, would you mind sharing with us where you learned to play like that?" Maria stood up slowly, still feeling like she might be dreaming. Her voice was quiet, but in the hushed hall, everyone could hear her clearly. "I learned from my grandmother when I was little," she began. "She taught me that music comes from the heart, not from expensive schools or fancy teachers. She said anyone can learn to play notes, but making music, real music, that comes from inside." She paused, gathering courage for what she needed to say next. "The truth is, I didn't always work as a cleaner. A long time ago, when I was younger, I was a music student too. I had scholarships, good teachers, big dreams. But life happened. My father left. My grandmother got sick. My family needed money, so I put away my dreams and did what I had to do." The audience listened in complete silence, hanging on every word. "I've been working here for 4 years, listening to all of you, Practice. Remembering what it felt like to love music that much. And yes, she looked directly at Alexander. I do play on a cheap keyboard at home. I do teach myself from videos on the internet. But that doesn't make the music any less real. She took a breath before continuing. Someone told me recently that there's a difference between people who are born for greatness and people who clean up after them. Maybe that's true. But I think there's also a difference between playing music and feeling music. Tonight, I just wanted to share something that brings me joy. Thank you for listening. The hall erupted again, but this time the applause was even more emotional. People were wiping away tears openly now. Several students rushed toward the stage, wanting to talk to Maria, to congratulate her, to ask her questions. Alexander remained, in his seat looking stunned. One of his friends leaned over and whispered, "Dude, that was incredible. You never told us she was that good." Alexander couldn't answer. He was thinking about all the things he'd said, all the assumptions he'd made. This woman had more musical talent in her little finger than he might ever have, and he'd treated her like she was nothing. The shame hit him like a physical blow as the crowd began to disperse. Alexander finally stood up and walked slowly toward the stage. Maria was surrounded by excited students and faculty, all talking at once, but she saw him approaching and the conversation gradually died down. He stopped a few feet away from her, struggling to find words. "Maria, he started, then stopped. What could he possibly say that would be enough? "I owe you an apology," he finally managed. "Actually, I owe you more than that. I was wrong about everything. About you. About music. About what matters. I'm sorry." Maria looked at him for a long moment. She could see the genuine remorse in his eyes, the shock of having his whole world view challenged in the span of 20 minutes. "Thank you," she said, simply. "But you don't owe me anything. We all have things to learn." As people began to leave the hall, Professor Rodriguez approached Maria with tears still visible in her eyes. "Maria," she said, "I don't know what your plans are, but I think we need to talk. Someone with your talent. There are opportunities, scholarships, programs for adult learners. It's never too late to come back to music officially." Maria smiled, feeling lighter than she had in years. "I'd like that very much." 6 months later, Maria was enrolled in the Academy's adult education program, studying piano performance on a full scholarship. Alexander, transformed by that night, had become one of her biggest supporters and, surprisingly, a close friend. He often said that Maria had taught him the most important lesson of his musical education, that talent has nothing to do with where you come from and everything to do with what you carry in your heart. And sometimes, late at night when the academy was empty, Maria would sit at that same grand piano where she'd played for the first time, remembering her grandmother's words about music being the language of the heart. She was finally speaking that language fluently, and it was more beautiful than she had ever dreamed.